From VOA Learning English, this is the Education Report in Special English. Tests of school children in South Africa show that they are not doing as well as they should. The government tested about 7 million children in 24,000 schools. This year, for the first time, testing included students in the 9th grade. There was a sharp drop in average scores from 1st grade to 9th grade in both mathematics and language. The news was not all bad, however. The country's basic education department said young students appeared to make gains compared to last year. This is especially true of 3rd graders. But the gains seemed to have disappeared in the 9th grade. At that level, only about 2% scored more than 50% in math. A spokesman for the Basic Education Department says although the results have been criticized, they show hopeful developments. Students from poor families scored well compared to wealthier students. And he said the study confirms that school attendance is high. Thabo Kupa serves on the executive committee of the Youth League of the ruling African National Congress. He said the results for the 9th grade are disappointing. He added that the test results call for officials to act. This year, South Africa's Basic Education Department was accused of failing to provide textbooks to students in the poor northern Limpopo province. An employee was accused of dropping about 700 of the badly needed books into a river in Limpopo. To educate an estimated 12 million students, the nation spends 207 billion rand, or about $23 billion. Education is South Africa's biggest budget item, and education spending is set to increase. For VOA Learning English, I'm Alex Villarreal. I'm Alex Villarreal with the VOA Special English Education Report. On July 9th, South Sudan becomes the world's 193rd nation. In January, almost 99% of voters chose independence from the North. South Sudan will also be one of the world's least developed nations. This follows years of war and neglect by the Sudanese government in Khartoum. South Sudan is about the size of France, yet it has only 50 kilometers of good roads and almost no public electrical power or other basic systems. Illiteracy rates are high. There are estimates that more than 80% of the population cannot read or write. There are 5 universities. 3 of them moved their operations to the north during the war. The southern government has brought most of the students back. Officials estimate that about 25,000 students have registered at the 5 universities. Classes were supposed to start in April, but the Ministry for Higher Education in the South has now moved the opening date to the middle of May. The government pays for food and provides housing for students. But Higher Education Minister Joseph Ukel says finding enough space was one reason for the delay. Another issue is money. The government in Khartoum will pay for the schools until July. Mr. Ukel says the southern government's proposed budget for this year does not include any money for the universities. Then there is the problem of teachers. Almost 75% of the lecturers are from the north. They are not likely to travel to the south to continue teaching for their schools. Mr. Ukel says his ministry has asked Southern Sudanese teachers outside the country to return. William Deng heads a commission supervising the return of 90,000 former fighters to civilian life. He says most of the soldiers who have come out of the Southern Army need education and training. He said, the skill they only know is soldiering. Now, you must train them with life skills, such as carpentry, making bricks, and also small agriculture or microfinancing. Only 4% of good land in South Sudan is being farmed. Millions of people need food aid to survive. The head of Juba University, Agre Abate, says his school can play a big part in training agricultural specialists. For VOA Special English, I'm Alex Villarreal. You can find transcripts and MP3s of our reports and other programs at voaspecialenglish.com.
From VOA Learning English, this is the Education Report. One World Education is a group with a program in which teachers develop teaching materials based on student writing. The students are in middle and high school and write essays about cultural and global issues. Students are invited to write about an issue they find important. Then, professionally developed learning materials based on chosen essays are used in schools to teach other students. Eric Goldstein is the executive director of One World Education, based in Washington. He says the nonprofit group has worked with over 1,500 student writers. He says 350 teachers use the One World curriculum. He says the essays can serve as a writing and learning guide for thousands of students. Mr. Goldstein is a former classroom teacher himself. He and another teacher began forming plans for One World Education in 2006. The group publishes a study unit each month from August through May. Each unit of the curriculum starts with an essay called a One World Reflection. The subjects have ranged from single parenthood to protecting rainforests to exploring Arab cultures, says Mr. Goldstein. Layla Kunesh of Washington wrote about her feeling that media reports in the United States are often unfair to Muslims. A learning activity based on her reflection called for students to collect examples of media stories and discuss whether or not that was true. Layla was chosen as a One World Student Ambassador last year. 12 students are chosen yearly. Their reflections are published on the group's website with learning activities and reading and writing aids. For VOA Learning English, I'm Laurel Bowman. From VOA Learning English, this is the Education Report. Students at St. Louis University have launched weather balloons into the sky above the city of St. Louis, Missouri. The United States Space Agency, NASA, is paying for the project to measure ozone gas. It is part of a study to learn more about air pollution and our climate. The students are getting the opportunity to carry out a real scientific experiment. They used a laptop computer and a radio receiver outside the St. Louis Science Center to communicate with data gathering devices on the balloon. Before launch, the students tested all the instruments and attached them to the weather balloon filled with helium. Gary Morris is a professor at Valparaiso University in Indiana. He is the lead trainer for the nationwide study. The professor says NASA wants more information on ozone because of how it affects our atmosphere. High above the Earth, in the stratosphere, the ozone layer keeps harmful ultraviolet radiation from reaching the ground. But in the lower atmosphere, emissions from cars and other sources like petrochemical plants form ozone pollution and smog. They cause unhealthy air conditions that affect breathing. Jack Fishman leads the ozone study at St. Louis University. He says new requirements that decrease pollution have lowered ozone levels in American cities. But he notes that pollution in remote areas continues to increase. He blames industrial activity in East Asia for that pollution. Jack Fishman says polluted air is being blown across the Pacific by air currents in the upper atmosphere. He says ozone pollution has slowed the growth of farm crops and forests. For VOA Learning English, I'm Laurel Bowman.
This is the VOA Special English Education Report. Some people think of politics as a game, but an online game lets people think of themselves doing one of the hardest jobs in American politics, cutting the federal budget. The game is called Budget Hero. Students in Los Angeles and other cities have been playing it. Budget Hero lets them decide how they want to spend federal tax dollars. The game uses information from the Congressional Budget Office. It shows what effects each cost-cutting proposal would have. High school student Dory Bennett says she thinks spending cuts are needed to keep the economy growing and keep the American dream alive. I want to grow up, go to college, get a good job, have kids maybe, a dog, and a house. The students consider the same issues facing lawmakers in Washington. The game was developed in 2008. In the newest version, students make decisions about what spending is important to them. Do they want to reduce taxes? Spend more on environmental protection? What about defense spending? Making these decisions helps clarify their goals. Jane Harmon is a former Democratic representative from California. She served in Congress for almost 20 years. She now heads the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars, which helped create Budget Hero. Ms. Harmon says the students are having more success than Congress at cutting the budget. More than 1 million people have played it so far, she says, and she thinks they have learned at least 2 things. 1, how hard it is, but 2, that it can be done if there's a will to do it. Student Jeffrey Burke agrees. The hardest thing for us to figure out was the little cuts, like the gas money and stuff, increasing taxes on gas, because we felt it would have effects everywhere, from the truck drivers shipping our stuff across the country, or when you order from Amazon or whatever, to your drive when you're going to work. I think we need to look at the little things and realize that just because they're small money doesn't mean they're small effects. Joaquin Alvarado is with American Public Media, an organization that also helped create the game. He says many of the players will literally, in the comments, ask that Congress play this game to just get a little rational around the questions that have to be answered. For VOA Special English, I'm Alex Villarreal. You can find a video of students playing Budget Hero at voaspecialenglish.com.
This is the VOA Special English Education Report. Web browsers first appeared on computers in the early 1990s. Since then, the Internet has greatly changed the way people communicate. But some teachers think the changes are not all for the better. Eleanor Johnson is an English professor at Columbia University in New York City. Professor Johnson says she thinks text messaging has made students believe that it is acceptable to make bad spelling and grammatical errors. She says her students have increasingly used less formal English in their writing. She says words and phrases like guy and you know now appear in research papers. And now she has to talk about another problem in class: incorrect word use. For example, a student uses preclude instead of proceed when talking about one event coming before another. Preclude sounds like proceed, but it means prevent. Professor Johnson suspects a strong link between the rise of instant and casual communication online and an increase in writing mistakes. But she admits there may not be much scientific evidence, at least not yet. David Crystal is a British linguist who has written more than 100 books, including the book Language and the Internet. He says the actively changing nature of the Internet makes it difficult to stay current in studying its effects. But he believes its influence on language is small. He says the main effect of the Internet on language has been to increase the expressive richness of language. Erin Jansen is founder of NetLingo, an online dictionary of Internet and text messaging terms. She says the new technology has not changed existing language, but has greatly added to the vocabulary. Basically, it's a freedom of expression, she says. And what about teachers who find these new kinds of mistakes in spelling and grammar in their students' work? What is her message to them? Ms. Jansen says she tells them not to get angry or upset, but to get creative. Teachers and educators want to get children to communicate. But Erin Jansen and David Crystal agree with Eleanor Johnson on at least one thing. Teachers need to make sure students understand the rules of language. And that's the VOA Special English Education Report. We want to know what you have to say about the effects of the Internet on language and writing. Post your comments at voaspecialenglish.com.
This is the VOA Special English Education Report. Most schools in the United States receive money from federal programs. That means most schools must obey a federal law known as Title IX. It bars discrimination on the basis of sex at any educational institution that receives federal money. An exception is made for admissions at private undergraduate schools. For others, Title IX covers any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. The full name is Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972. A lot of Americans may be surprised to know that it was written without saying anything directly about sports. Yet that is where its effects are best known, especially at the high school level. After Title IX became law, the number of girls who joined high school sports teams sharply increased. Research has linked participation in sports to positive effects, like better self-image, fewer teen pregnancies, and higher grades. But are these a direct result? Two recent studies suggest that the answer is yes. They offer long-term evidence that it can lead to improvements in education, work, and health. Betsy Stevenson is a business and public policy researcher at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. She compared states, looking at differences in high school sports participation and in women's education and work. For each 10 percentage point increase in sports participation, she found a 1 point increase in female college attendance. She also linked it to a 1 to 2 point increase in the number of women in the labor force. The other study looked at physical health. Robert Kessner is an economics professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago. He compared obesity rates and physical activity levels of women who had been in high school before and after Title IX took effect. He found that those who came after Title IX had a 7% lower risk of obesity 20 to 25 years later. Nicole Lavoie is Associate Director of the Tucker Center for Research on Girls and Women in Sport at the University of Minnesota. She says the new studies are important because they show trends over time. Still, she says, far more boys than girls joined sports teams nearly 40 years after Title IX gave girls a chance to level the playing field. And that's the VOA Special English Education Report. You can post comments at voaspecialenglish.com.